I appreciate each and every lesson that I have heard today, and know some more great lessons are yet to come. Again, I cannot emphasize the great debt of gratitude that the entire brotherhood owes to the Bellview congregation for making this book available, as well as the DVDs and through other means such as the Defender, simply allowing people to be made aware of the dangers of the AD 70 doctrine in order that congregations can be prepared and be set for the defense of the gospel. And so this is a very noteworthy theme and a remarkable theme for your 40th annual. Before we get to question number 7, and we're starting with question number 7 because that's the number of perfection. And reference has been made to the fact that if we are now in the new heavens and the new earth, as the AD 70 aorists affirm that we are, and there is no marriage, why then is Max King married and Don Preston married? And I just checked on Tim King, and he also is married. It says he is a speaker and writer, has a passion for life. Watch his Presence Today webcast on Presence TV each week. As president of Presence Ministries International, he and his family live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I can't say for sure about all the others, but I would suspect the majority of them, if not all of them, are married. And therefore, the contradictions just become so incredulous. Can they observe the Lord's Supper upon the first day of the week? Why? Can they teach that there is one church for which Christ died? Not while they're standing side by side with denominational speakers in conference after conference after conference. In question number 7, and I'll admit I did not study down this far because I didn't think we would get to question 7. What is the attraction about the realized eschatology doctrine? What would motivate one to hold to this heresy? I'll start with my own personal observation, and that's going to again take us back to my days with the Central Congregation there in Ardmore, Oklahoma. It was pretty apparent to me that Don Preston became enamored with a false doctrine known as Max Kingism, and he wanted to be a lone voice in the wilderness, so to speak. It's like the Athenians of Acts 17. They simply lived either to tell or to hear some new doctrine. You look at Steve Baisden, you look at Don Preston, you look at William Bell, you look at Max R. King and Timothy R. King, and a couple of other names that have been batted about this week. And in the research and the study that I have been able to do, these men, in the books that they have written, or the tracts that they have written, or the articles that they have written, do not recognize the AD 70 doctrine as being something worth writing about, or teaching about, or preaching about prior to 1970, and Max King's introduction of his material to the preachers' meetings there in Warren, Ohio. All of their writings that I've been able to find that are what I call pro-AD 70 are this side of Max King and his book, The Spirit of Prophecy. You go back before 1970, and as I pointed out in my initial lesson, Max R. King himself actually by those who know him and have known him through the years say that he was a faithful gospel preacher for almost 40 years. And then all of a sudden he is espousing this AD 70 heresy that we know for a fact dates back to the to the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century, the 16th century, and all the way back to the 1st century, as Brother Johnny was telling us about just a moment ago, and the warning that Paul sounds forth there in 2 Timothy about Hymenaeus and Philetus. And so the attraction, in my estimation, cannot be a desire for the truth of God's Word. Because you think about those things that are advocated as taking place in AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem, and the AD 70 aorist will tell you that all of these things had to wait until AD 70. Remission of sins, change in the priesthood, a change in the law, Christ's reign as king, the kingdom established with power, or the kingdom established fully, the second coming of our Lord, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment day, death and Hades would come to an end, all prophecy fulfilled, the way opened for the new heaven and the new earth, eternal rest realized, the end of the world, and of course the last days would come to an end. And every one of those points stands diametrically opposed to the teaching of the New Testament and Holy Spirit-inspired New Testament writers. King himself said in Spirit of Prophecy, page 3 of his introduction, that this theory, quote, may be a little unorthodox. And I believe I pointed out or got to the quote in the lesson I presented from Beagle himself, a whole new view of the Scripture will open up. That's Spirit of Prophecy, page 5. And what I had a lot of trouble figuring out was his comment on page 135. Max R. King said, quote, error complements error. Now just let that one roll around in your head for a moment and ask yourself, you cannot help but to be influenced to think that these men are looking to make a name among the brotherhood, and in trying to make a name among the brotherhood, as far as I'm concerned, they have left the brotherhood. Don Preston in Ardmore, Oklahoma, took 300 members from a 600-member congregation and called that group the Ardmore Church of Christ. And as I pointed out, between the 2012 edition and the 2015 edition, he actually had the group to change its name to the Ardmore Family of God. Now, if you want to look for the appellation of the Family of God in the New Testament, you're going to have to turn to Titus 5:19, and once you get there, you're going to discover it is not there. And so they have become a cult, a sect, another man-made denomination among many man-made denominations, and they do stand shoulder to shoulder with false teachers. And just before we started this session, there were some who were asking, well, is it possible that this thing is motivated by money? And again, think about a congregation that has a sizable budget, and a false teacher goes in, and as Mr. Preston did in Ardmore, Oklahoma, he starts sowing his doctrine at first on Wednesday nights, so you wouldn't have everybody there. And then he slips it into the Sunday evening sermon, and then he slips it into the bulletin, and finally it ended up in the pulpit on Sunday morning. But it was a very gradual thing. These brethren don't go in on one day and say, okay, we're going to become a satellite congregation for Max R. King. They realize that they have to be very devious. They have to be deceptive in the way that they go about implanting their man-made doctrine. And now you go to the website for Don Preston today, and he is going to direct you very quickly to the bookstore. Now, why would he want you in his bookstore? Those are some of my thoughts. I'm sure that there are other men here who may have thought about this even more than I have. Brother Daniel.
Daniel Denham from Parrish, Florida, the North River Church of Christ. Two thoughts. One, if you go back into the 19th century and you start looking at the individuals that took this position, virtually all of them were Universalists. I have a commentary set by Lucius R. Page on the New Testament, and you can just about lay his commentary out side by side with a lot of these books and predict what they're going to say by what he said on various texts. They were virtually all, if they were full preterists in the 19th century, they were Universalists. The second thread of them were modernists. And Universalist also is along that line, but their modernism is what prompted them to take that position. C.H. Dodd and his doctrine of realized eschatology was designed to reduce the prophetic scope of prophecy. Well, one of the greatest evidences for the inspiration of the Scriptures is what? Predictive prophecy, especially prophecy that encompassed hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. For those prophecies to be pinpoint accurate and things of that nature, well, he took this position in order to reduce predictive prophecy to that of, to reduce the prophets to the work of forecasters, weather predictors, and the same especially in the New Testament. So whether or not universalism, I know that with Max King and his immediate group that's now around him, universalism is a big factor. And I predict that even though they are denying it at present, that Don Preston, Steve Basden, Holger Neubauer, Scott Claft, and all the current leaders of that movement will be universalists. They are side by side working with some who are already universalists. Some of them who are supporting and encouraging them are annihilationists. And we've been dealing with a young man in one discussion group that he is an annihilationist, and he is a big supporter of Don Preston, Steve Basden, and all of these men, and they've not taken him to task one bit on his annihilationism. So they're willing to countenance that and to put up with it in order to have his support.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen Antecoli. I'm from Steubenville, Ohio originally, but I'm living presently in Columbus, Ohio. I appreciate everything that's been said so far by the men that have spoken, but my thoughts are that they're claiming that everything that's spoken of in the prophets sees its fulfillment in 70 A.D. Peter preaching in chapter 3 of Acts, to me this ends it all. In verse 24, he said, "Yea, and all the prophets from Samuel and those that follow after, as many as have spoken, have likewise foretold of these days." Not someday 40 years down the road, but these days. To me, that ends it all. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Adam Diaz from Gulfport, Mississippi, worship at Morris Road Church of Christ. I can understand how the leaders and how you're saying, but what about these 300 in the account that followed Don Preston, and what is their motivation for accepting something and also being able to stand and hold to that sort of doctrine? What is their motivation? And the followers, I can see how those in power would like that, but what about those who are following?
Okay. I do not know how many have had any personal contact with Don Preston, but I will tell you he is a very likable fellow. He is quite commanding in his presence. I attended his debate there in Ardmore. As a matter of fact, helped to arrange that debate in Ardmore between him and Bill Lockwood. And at that debate, I discovered that Don Preston had a way of working the crowd, and he had a way of trying to win people over to him on not because of what he was teaching, not because of what he was saying, but because of their admiration for him, their liking him. The majority of those 300 that went with him, well, I have related already to you the story about one of the elders from that congregation and his great knowledge of the Bible when he heard 1 Corinthians 15 being quoted, and leaned back in his chair, and as an elder in the Lord's church, so-called, he said, "I never read anything like that anywhere in my Bible." And I had one lady that I had a discussion with who went with the 300, and she was one of the big money givers to keep that work going. And she said that in her book, Don Preston was responsible for the sun, the moon, and the stars.
I'm Michael Hatcher from Pensacola, Florida, and this doctrine removes sin. There is no sin with this doctrine. That's a pretty comforting doctrine if you're going to be living in sin. Thus, one of the attractions of it would obviously be, I'm not doing anything wrong. And even if I do anything wrong, there's really no heaven or hell. So what difference does it make even if I am living in sin? As we would call sin, but sin doesn't really exist for them.
That's true. Before you come up, Brother Deb, at one point during the time that this problem had plagued us there in Ardmore, Oklahoma, Don Preston somehow had arranged a meeting with about 6 or 7 of the sisters from the central congregation in the home of one of those members. And she came to me after they had had their meeting with Don Preston. It was pretty obvious that he was trying to proselyte all of those sisters to become a part of his new group. And in that discussion, these sisters said to me that Don Preston had said to them that he could no longer sin, that he was above sin, that sin was no longer a part of his life. Well, that's realized eschatology. When you take it to its fullness, there is no sin, hence no consequence for sin.
Deb McClish, Denton, Texas. Michael's statement reminded me of the denominational doctrine on faith only. It's a very wholesome doctrine and full of comfort that you cannot sin. In answer to Adam's question, why would 300 people follow a man into such ridiculous doctrine and theology? Why did several hundred people drink Kool-Aid for Jim Jones? I think you have similar answers there. Mm-hmm. Men come along and they fall prey to one of those 3 avenues of sin in 1 John 2, verse 15, the pride of life, or the vainglory of life. And I personally think that this has to do with the matter a great deal. It's always risky to assign motive when you don't know for sure, but all you can do is guess from the words that people say and the way people behave themselves, the attitudes that they express. But there just seem to be some people that have to have something that set them apart from everyone else, and that seek a following in that island that they establish for themselves. I think we see that in Dan Billingsley. I think we see that, very frankly, in Mac Deaver. And there are others who have been in the same sort of attitude, and some of them depict themselves as the Alexander Campbell of this day. And that's the way they think of themselves and the influence they have and how important and significant they are, and therefore their doctrine.
By the way, Don Preston did make the statement and likened himself to being an Alexander Campbell among the Lord's church today. And so when you look at the entire situation, I am thoroughly convinced that Don Preston wanted very much to be the successor to Max R. King, but Timothy R. King had a legal error and he took advantage of that quite apparently. I also want to mention that the congregation that Don started, built, whatever, started out with approximately 300 members. In the 2012 edition in the 21st century edition of Where the Churches of Christ Meet, the 300 had become 100. And in 2015, they're not listed because they were no longer listed as the Ardmore Church of Christ. They had become the family of God. They had become a man-made denomination and therefore would no longer be listed. But according to some brethren who are still living in Ardmore, it looks like their group is probably around 50 or so today. So they are continually declining. The sad thing is those brethren must not have returned to Maxwell Avenue. I know that they have not gone to the Central Church of Christ, now known as the McClish Avenue Church of Christ, and Brother Deb will tell you they misspelled McClish. But but where are they? Are they in man-made denominations? Have they quit the church? Will there be elders who will give an account for 300 souls? Brethren, that should concern every child of God's. Just a moment ago, we made reference to Charles H. Dodd. You know, Tim King wrote a biographical sketch of his father, and he challenges the readers to, quote, check the copyright dates of any fulfilled prophecy author from the last century. None are earlier than 1971, unquote. And when I read that, I could hardly believe what I was reading. I thought to myself, well, did he not read his father's writings? And in 1936, Charles H. Dodd wrote The Apostolic Preaching and Its Development. He taught that the final events were fulfilled during the personal ministry of Christ. But his teaching was even then being described as realized eschatology. In 1917, Marion Morris published Christ's Second Coming, and on page 48 he writes, and I quote, finally, the last days with the spiritual night came to an end, and we are now living in God's eternal day, unquote. Well, that's exactly what the realized eschatologist of today is saying. In 1900, Dr. William S. Ermey of the California Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, I want you to catch that, Methodist Episcopal Church, presented his book, Christ Came Again, and its realized eschatology. In 1898, Dr. Milton S. Terry, a Methodist Episcopalian trained at Yale Divinity School, presented his work, Biblical Apocalyptics, and he presents the preterist arguments for Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Then we have Dr. James Russell in 1878. We have an N. Nisbet in 1787. And we've not even dealt with the Jesuits who were writing in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and all of them teaching realized eschatology. Other questions or comments on this aspect? What happens when one dies according to realized eschatology? Well, as has been observed a number of times, who was it that said, "What about us?" Is that you, Brother Charles? What about us? In other words, why are we here? If the doctrine of Max King and those who follow after Max King be true, then what does that mean to us? On more than one occasion, I have likened this doctrine to one aspect of Calvinism. Calvinism says that all men, from before the foundation of the world, predetermined to be saved or predetermined to be lost. Well, when you pick up the writings of the Kingites and you study what they are saying, well, in the year of 70 AD, with the destruction of Jerusalem, came the Judgment Day. That means that in AD 70, you and I were judged. At that time, it was determined whether we would be lost or whether we would be saved, and whatever that judgment was, it's a done deal. You and I have nothing to do with it. Someone asked you the question, what must I do to be saved? Well, as a Kingite, absolutely, positively nothing at all. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do and be lost. There's nothing at all you can do and be lost. Either you are saved or lost, and it was determined in AD 70. It was predetermined. That's Calvinism, just a different time frame. And they like that terminology, time frame.
Daniel Denham. What's fascinating with them on this is if you ask them, well, what about the righteous? They say, well, they go immediately to heaven at death. And then the question comes, but what passage teaches that? All of the passages they cite were written and consummated according to their own doctrine in AD 70. How do they apply? By what measure or by what line of reasoning do you apply that passage beyond AD 70? I asked Steve Basden if he was part of the whosoever in Acts 2, verse 21. He said he was. Then I asked him, was Acts 2, verse 21, part of the prophecy of Joel? Oh, no, it's not part of the prophecy of Joel. It's a benefit of the prophecy. Well, I showed from Joel chapter 2, verse 32, that Acts 2, verse 21 is an inspired citation, quotation of Joel 2:32, which obviously is part of the prophecy of Joel. The point being this: whether they will admit it or not, if they claim they can be saved or people can be saved and are part of the whosoever, this side of AD 70, they imply in every single case that that aspect of the prophecy is still in the process of being fulfilled. Simply because the miraculous was fulfilled and has been completed does not mean that all of the prophecy has been completed. That doesn't necessarily follow. And that is something that seems to be beyond their grasp. They simply can't get it. But if they're teaching people, in fact, he will brag about, oh, we baptized another man. We led him to Christ. He's now part of the whosoever. Well, thank you, Brother Steve. You just demonstrated that all prophecy did not end at AD 70. And every time you dip somebody else, you're still proving the same point and refuting your own doctrine.
Very good.
So the question was, what happens when one, what?
What happens when one dies according
What?
to...
When one what? By the way, I'm Michael Hatcher from Bellview.
Good.
There, in that world, there is no death. So what's the question?
No pain. Very good. Oh, you got me there. Wasn't quite prepared for that. The challenge of Tim King when he says find an author prior to 1971 who is writing the aspect of realized eschatology is not a difficult challenge. Matter of fact, it has been demonstrated by a number of authors, a number of dates, all of them long before 1971. And I want to come back to what I stated just a few moments ago. You look at Steve Basden, Don Preston, Max King, Timothy R. King, whoever it is, and look for books that they have written, articles that they have written prior to the date of 1970, where they were espousing the AD 70 doctrine, and you cannot find it. It simply does not there. If it's there, I have yet to find it. And then comes Max King, his book Spirit of Prophecy, and then here they come. It is that desire either to tell or to hear some new thing. Are we going to have time for another question, you think?
Maybe it's just short.
Ooh. Don't really have a short one here. He knows the questions. Let me go ahead then and wrap this up, and we will turn it over to Brother Michael. I want to say again, it is Calvary and not the AD 70 doctrine of the destruction of Jerusalem where Christ paid the price for the sins of fallen man. And I was having a discussion during the noon hour with someone, and we were talking about the book by Hokema on the four major cults, and how an identifying mark of a cult is a shifting of emphasis. And these folks have taken away the cross, the precious cross of Jesus Christ my Lord, and they have replaced it with the destruction of a local city by the name of Jerusalem in AD 70 at the hands of General Titus. And brethren, that is blasphemy. Amen. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. And as I have already stated, souls are in the balance. And that's why, again, I say to you, this book is a great contribution to our entire brotherhood. Let every elder possess a copy. Let every preacher possess a copy. Let every church library possess a copy. And I hope you will get a copy.